Over.
Okay, thank you. Is this on? Yes. I do think that that standard provides a broad set of guidelines that is sensible. It is comprehensive enough to cover, basically, it covers the bases. But what I really want to talk about, and I sensed from the previous panel a sense of frustration, which I think is entirely warranted. It's been 2 years now, as has been noted, more than 2 years since September 11th. Governor Kane, you mentioned Senator Corzine, I heard several panels ago. He is one of the leaders on chemical facilities. Let's just take that as one example. One out of many, but one example. More than 2 years since September 11th, more than a year since the current Secretary of Homeland Security wrote in the Washington Post, and I'll quote, "Chemical facilities must be required to take the steps the industry leaders are taking at their facilities. Voluntary efforts alone are not sufficient to provide the level of assurance Americans deserve." That was more than a year ago. Nothing mandatory has happened. 60 Minutes had a dramatic expose within the last week or 10 days in which camera crews were able to enter chemical facilities, open gates, unguarded, walk up to dangerous chloride, ammonia, other tanks. If they had been wearing explosives, one can imagine what would have happened. And again, it's 2 years since September 11th, a year since this statement, nothing has occurred. I think one of the most important things that this commission could do is issue a very clear call that that's just unacceptable, and that leadership needs to be exerted both from the executive branch and from the Congress to move forward. I'd be happy to talk about the specifics of how I think, for example, in chemical facilities or other areas we could move forward. I think there are ways of doing this in a market-friendly way so that we are using market forces rather than just assuming that markets will work. We're instead guiding them and harnessing the power of markets to provide better security. So that, I guess, took me a little bit off the immediate topic, but I think it's so important that I wanted to get it in. I have nothing against the standard that was being discussed. I think it is a good start, but it's not enough. And I think one of the most important things that this commission could do is to provide clear guidance that we have not done enough on strengthening market incentives for protecting potentially catastrophic attacks against private sector entities.
I'm going to segue over to Thomas Susman at this point in time, really to look at the private sector perspective in particular in mind, and if you will, the management viewpoint in terms of looking at an overall standard, again, to keep us at least initially focused on NFPA 1600 as well. That's a good starting point. And then more generically, where you'd like to see to go, you'd like to see things go from there.
Thank you. It's always easy to be comfortable with process standards. Even as Mr. Orszag said, it's useful to have market-friendly standards. Wish that it were so, and therein lies the problem of what I've heard today is basically a rush to standards. I don't want to suggest that standards are a problem or that standards should not be imposed or adopted by the business community. But I do want to suggest that standards carry with them, and historically, whether building standards or product standards or process standards, they carry with them certain caveats. They are often used to suppress competition. They often result in freezing technology. They often burden businesses more than the expected return. They're often used by one sector or segment against another within an industry. That's why we have two building codes still. And so this notion of, part of the problem is the top-down standard, which the public generally would like to see. That is, government set standards. Congress give us standards. Department of Homeland Security give us standards. There is another way, and I think the collaborative standard setting that involves the stakeholders, which will take a longer time. And I would share the frustration of, you mean we're going to have to wait longer to have this happen? And the answer is yes. If it's going to be done in a way that the affected sector or geographic area of the business community understands, buys in, doesn't oppose the standards process, doesn't try to undercut it, doesn't try to use it or abuse it, then it's going to take time. But the key to all of this is cooperation and collaboration. And if done really from the bottom up rather than the top down, these standards processes can succeed.
Thank you. In fact, Peter, a good follow-up, Peter Harvey, as I alluded to earlier, you've just undertaken an effort really within the state of New Jersey that involved a diversity of joint efforts between both the governmental side and the private sector side. Could you reflect on that and tell me whether or not there's a relevance there?
Sure. What we did in New Jersey is shortly after September 11th in October of 2001, our legislature enacted a statute that created the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force. It is made up of governmental heads. It is now chaired by the Attorney General, and it includes the heads of the Department of Health and Senior Services, the Department of Environmental Protection, Transportation. What we did was first identify 110 critical infrastructure sites in the state of New Jersey that required protection. The second thing that we did was identify 23 industry sectors with which we would work. Now, the act that creates the task force also creates the Infrastructure Advisory Committee. I think it was the legislature's understanding that government and business have to be interdependent in this task. We cannot get into, at least in our view, a series of governmental mandates because I don't think we'll get uniform cooperation. I think it'll ultimately produce more conflict than it does harmony. But through these 23 industry sector chairs, the task force issued an order that required that these industries, number one, conform to any existing federal standard. Secondly, that they also go beyond that in protecting their own industry facilities by implementing either industry mandated or offered standards or by implementing best security standards developed by the Infrastructure Advisory Committee, or if those two didn't exist, by the task force standards. I think what we've had with our best security practices is layers of security. And let me suggest that I think that ultimately where we'll end up nationally is with layers of protection and layers of security. Here's what I mean. I think that the national government, certainly in collaboration between the Congress and the executive branch, can set certain minimum standards, but I think that's all that the national government can do. I think after that you have to almost go industry by industry. For example, nuclear power facilities are almost invariably by water. So while the NRC controls the internal workings of those facilities, what do you do about water approaches? That's invariably going to require that you have standards, and it's going to require equipment and protection from the Coast Guard. In our state, we have New Jersey State Police that have Marine Patrol units, but some states don't have them. So what is going to be your standard of protection for those facilities? And I would always ask the question, as I think the task force does, what are we protecting against? When we look at these standards, the National Fire Protection Association standards, let's keep in mind that they were designed to protect against fire. Let's think about the kinds of risks to which we are now exposed. We are exposed to chemical hazards, biological hazards, nuclear hazards, incendiary devices. So as we look at standards, we're going to have to identify standards that address these several types of hazards, and that's what we tried to do through working seamlessly with industry. The goal here is to make sure, and by the way, the standards that apply to one industry, it's stating the obvious, don't apply to other industries. There may be standards that apply to the chemical industry that really don't apply to the pharmaceutical industry or don't apply to the hospital sector. So I think as we go sector by sector, and also as we work with the national government, we will come up with layers of protection. There will be a minimum level of protection, and then we will go industry by industry and add more layers on depending upon the kind of protection that that particular industry needs.
Peter, only because this is a potential model, could you just briefly elaborate on let's take an industry, any particular industry, that's chemical perhaps. How did that happen? You identified, you know where it is in your state itself. Yeah. There's a regulatory entity, presumably your environmental protection among others.
Well, I think what we tried to do and what we in fact implemented was a relationship between that state governmental entity that had jurisdiction or supervision or a natural match with that particular industry. So in the case of a chemical facility, the Department of Environmental Protection is the most likely state department that has some regulatory authority over that industry. We have an a domestic security preparedness planning group. That is essentially the staff of the task force. That planning group sat down with representatives of the chemical industry sector, and they began to identify all of the known perceptible risks, and they also began to identify the kinds of hazards from which each was seeking protection. Now, what came out of that was a best security practices protocol that incorporated governmental ideas about what ought to be good security practice, but also industry ideas. Let me caution us. I do not believe that simply because we are in government, it makes us smarter. I happen to think that sometimes, because we don't come out of certain industries, there are nuances about that industry that we simply don't know, and you have to learn them. That, by definition, requires the input of people who work in those industries, who can tell you about nuances that you would simply overlook. Some of the kinds of security practices that we looked at were which employees have access to which portions of the plant. What kind of security badges do you have? What kind of background checks do you do on your employees? What kind of chemical storage do you have? And by the way, how much of that information do you put in the public domain? So these are the kinds of issues that we had to explore. Our committees worked on these plans very carefully, and what we came up with were best security practices that we are now about the business of implementing, and we're going to come back and monitor the implementation. The task force will come back and monitor the implementation of these security practices to ensure that they're not simply written and that they don't just sit on the shelf, but they're actually being performed by the industry. But I think we will get more cooperation and compliance because this is the industry's program as much as it is government's.
Both you and Peter Orszag mentioned, if you will, a mixed approach with some minimum standards coupled by arguably what might be some voluntary standards. What would you see as base minimum that would more or less move across a number of different industries relative to preparedness? Peter, I'd ask Peter Orszag first.
Well, I think it is difficult to define even a minimum across a wide variety of sectors, but I would make 2 or 3 points with regard to the generic approach. I guess we're morphing a little bit into incentives, but that's inevitable. I think in a lot of settings, the kind of approach that makes the most sense is one similar to the rules that apply when you drive your car. There's a regulatory approach. You need to take a driver's test in order to be allowed to drive your car. But there also are incentives for you to be safer than just the average person. So for example, if you're a particularly safe driver, you will get an insurance break, at least if your insurance company is like some insurance companies. And that gives you an incentive to drive more safely than just the sort of minimum regulatory standard would otherwise suggest. Similarly, when in the Homeland Security arena, setting some minimum standard, and we can talk about specifically what that is. I have some ideas for chemical facilities, for buildings and others, but relatively low minimum standard provides a sort of base level of security, which should only apply in areas where there's a potential for catastrophic harm. I don't think we should be setting Homeland Security standards for corner supermarkets. But for athletic arenas, that's a different story. So a minimum standard. It also provides guidance. This came up on the earlier panel. It provides some guidance for negligence and for liability if there would be an attack for the legal system. And then you go beyond that in various different ways. One area that I want to commend the administration on, article in the New York Times this morning about incentives for shippers to go put more secure devices on the containers that are coming into the United States, the so-called smart boxes, And the incentives are very simple. You do this, you come through customs very quickly. You don't do it, you go into the red light, the red zone, and it's going to take a lot longer for your shipment to clear customs. Makes total sense in my opinion. There are a whole variety of dimensions in which we can provide that kind of incentive to go beyond some minimum and to become a lot safer that are not overly intrusive government regulations that provide incentives for innovation and that will allow us to address this problem at least cost over time.
Mr. Susman, from the private sector perspective about minimal regulation.
Well, I think minimum standards can be useful as we suggest as an approach to regulation generally is let's first see whether the private sector responds on its own through incentives of the marketplace, insurance, liability, good citizenship, corporate board management. In cases where years have gone by, government has said you should do something, industry gets together and no progress occurs, and we've heard some examples of that, then government appropriately can step in at the time. All right, what does government do when it steps in? These standards don't come sort of like magically out of the head of Zeus. They have to be developed by someone, and that's a process. I don't have the answer about where it should be set, but I can suggest that we have processes for going about regulating business that include public participation, public notice, cooperation, sometimes negotiation, studies, research, so that we do have some level of confidence that we set the standard in the right place, because one of the problems, of course, is if we miss by a lot in either direction, we either have done nothing or we're going to have widespread avoidance activities, and we would be better off not having a standard.
This might be a worthwhile opportunity, maybe segue to the other, if you will, private sector perspective in James Havarius. Clearly there's a lot of, in the building side of the house, or buildings and owners, a lot of clear baseline standards. They reflect themselves in life safety codes, fire codes, building codes, and so forth. And I guess I would pose to you the question of, do you see a need for evolution in that regard in the post 9/11 environment, and how would you see that happening?
Well, it's very funny. I got your NFPA 1600, and I actually had to read it because that's not what building owners follow. They follow Local Law 5 in New York City. That's what everybody considers their emergency preparedness. And it is predominantly for fire and evacuation on just 2 floors, the floor of the fire and the floor below. That is it. Full evacuations, I heard many people ask about liabilities and questions, It is a liability issue. Does a building owner of a trophy property having 9,000 to 10,000 people in the building at one time want to evacuate in Manhattan? We saw it happen on 9/11. We saw it happen a day after. And in the Rockefeller Center area, we had upwards of 125,000 people on the street. We had to shut down streets, 6th Avenue, which almost never gets shut down. Became total chaos. We do not follow that code. We would like to see a code now that does involve bombs, lethal gas, radiation, water contamination. That the Local Law 5 needs to evolve into a bigger code that consists part of your NFPA 1600. But in New York City, your major cities like Chicago, I think I agree with my panelist here that there probably will need to be layers depending on where you are. The Rockefeller Group owns trophy properties in Midtown Manhattan. We also own properties on Exit 8A in Cranberry, New Jersey that don't have the same threat. We have property and buildings in Orlando, West Palm Beach. There's no threat. When we had all these threats and we had all these problems and I conferred with my counterparts in these locations, they were going, I'm going home, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, everybody was locked down. You couldn't get out or in whether you liked it or not. I totally agree. There needs to be different levels. There needs to be some cooperation between local, federal, and state officials, though, and all the parties involved in some kind of national code. You see this right now with the electrical code. There's New York City code, there's fire department code, and there's a national code, and they've worked very hard now to comprise one code nationally. It hasn't been approved and ratified by everybody yet, and it's 2 years in the making, But if we could get to a point where we all have a code and understand very realistically that there's got to be different levels, I think that's a very significant improvement for everyone at this point.
Actually, you echoed a number of things that came up in the actual roundtables themselves, and they did reflect a frustration even by those folks that were, if you will, internal code enforcement in the firms themselves, saying, listen, I've got this on this side saying this, I got a federal code on that side, I've got city codes, state codes, and including confusion to a great extent as to which is predominant. Question. In particular, New York State had an evolution, was mentioned, New York City had an evolution of its code that was referenced earlier today relative to Local Law 5 and the post 9/11 situation. We didn't really get into too great a detail in the prior panel on that. Are you familiar with those? I think it was 13 that were essentially approved by the mayor, and what is your perspective on those as to how they, their relevance and how they'd impact your operation?
The 13 you approved out of 22 will not have a major overall impact as far as cost or manpower or anything like that goes to. Some of the bigger issues, the biggest issue right now is most people do have their fresh air intakes that supply your HVAC systems at the street level, and you're very vulnerable, and a couple of my buildings are that way. And the impact to change that would be in the millions of dollars category. In lost revenue because of rental and just trying to reconfigure the building. The other codes that he's proposing changes, most of the building owners were part of the committee, are for it, and will make every effort to do it quickly rather than wait for maybe or possibly his 5-year rollout like there was with Local Law 5.
Can you bullet point 2 or 3 of what they were?
Major one is we noticed that because of you have fire department code and electrical code, your staircases have to have lighting on a 4-hour battery backup. They don't have to run forever. And in a major event, it's going to take more than 4 hours to get everybody down the staircase in a high-rise office building. So they're talking, a proposal was to put photoluminescent paint or tape or something like that on the staircases. The proposal to do full building evacuations is great. It creates a code that we have to follow, and there's no more liability issues. We did it in several buildings. People having health conditions couldn't make it down the staircases. We had to call an ambulance. But if there's a code to that effect, everybody will follow, and you can plan much better. Those are 2 major ones that I see everybody complying with quickly. The HVAC issue can be a nightmare for a lot of the bigger buildings, especially the older ones. The vintage 1950s, much like Time and Life, the old Rockefeller Center, the landmark properties, the Empire State Building. They will have major issues trying to configure their building and their systems to meet those codes.
If we're to more or less kind of develop some relative consensus on at least maybe to echo some of the comments, I think on both private, public sector, there's a concurrence that some level of standards or common directions are out there, a need clearly for them out there, a desire perhaps in the private sector to lead with voluntary and industry-oriented perspectives. Ones, as to paraphrase, I think Mr. Susman, to essentially, let us deal with our own issues to start with, and if not, allow government to step in. Question being, really, at what point in time do you think that would be appropriate? But if we were looking, just again to reflect that is one of the issues, at least I heard on your end, a consensus that there's a need out there for some directions, but it is a concern, if you will, relative to government stepping in too soon. What type of timetable would you put on that?
Actually, I'm glad you re-raised the issue, because it sounds as if, when you repeat it, and it's probably accurate, that I suggested that government ought not be involved from the start. The interdependence of all of the businesses and business and government, mentioning sectors, technology and communications, transportation, there are no clear lines. And so the notion that government shouldn't be engaged and involved early on is not what I was advancing. It was a notion that government shouldn't start with the theory, with the approach, we need to regulate this, that Congress and the agencies shouldn't begin with a regulatory mentality, but government should participate in the development. And if government is participating in the development of the standards, then the government agencies involved will know when the time has come to step in with a regulatory approach. And if they're not, if they're just sort of standing back, then they won't have an idea of how difficult some of these issues can be to resolve. For example, they may think that moving HVAC entries is a relatively easy thing to do, and unless the people from the various responsible government agencies are part of that process, they wouldn't understand that you'd have to reconfigure a building to accomplish that goal.
Peter.
I just wanted to, I guess I have a slightly different perspective. I agree that the government should not approach, frankly, any homeland security problem with the thought that a regulatory approach, especially an old command and control type regulatory approach, is the initial way to go. But I think it is equally dangerous, and perhaps frankly even more so given what we've observed over the past 2 years, to assume that market forces alone will develop the security that's needed. I just don't think that will happen. The incentives are there, but they're not strong enough to provide an adequate level of security, like Secretary Ridge himself emphasized. To return to the example of chemical facilities again, I think it's clear we've waited too long. And I don't see why we continue to wait. It doesn't make any sense to me. So while I agree that we should not, assume that we're going to regulate our way out of this problem, that would, A, be excessively costly, and B, not be particularly well attuned to the problem that we face. Terrorism, unlike many other problems that government has tried to tackle in the past, is an evolving threat in which the people that commit the acts of terrorism can respond to what you've done. So you go and regulate A and fix A, terrorists respond and just don't attack A, they attack B. And that's a fundamental difference. Natural catastrophes don't think that way, for example. Terrorists do. So a regulatory approach is one that should be avoided and used as only a last resort. I agree, I think, with Tom perhaps on that note. But I think we should not approach this as thinking that the government can not exactly sit back, but at least just observe and interact without worrying about how market incentives are aligned. You can't just let markets work. You need to make markets work in Homeland Security. They will not work by themselves.
You've actually opened up the issue of incentives, and if we presume for a moment on the standard side that there's a relative consensus that whatever's done in standard-wise should be joint in nature, how soon the regulatory element comes to play is an issue of discussion here. And perhaps some of those regulations, there's a clear acknowledgement, at least on the standard side, I should say, that whatever standards that are developed should be specific, most likely where possible, to both industry as well as probably location and or organization size. But if we move to really what is the second element of really what was distilled down by the round tables, and we look at the issues of incentives, the question becomes, given that for a moment that we have a set of standards that arguably may be specifically developed in cooperation on an industry basis, what is going to motivate their application? And I've taken a liberty to throw up some existing incentives, if you will, that are up there. I don't want to bound the discussion by that. There's mention of the OSHA Emergency Action Plan requirement, which is a very fundamental, simple requirement, really requiring an evacuation plan. Really no description per se beyond that, other than the fact that it needs to be in writing if there's more than 11 employees. Life safety code compliances, clearly we've mentioned earlier that those challenges still exist in terms of both sometimes conflicting but also issues of jurisdiction. The legal liability issue that was referenced earlier with respect to concern about liability for suit. We saw the federal judge, his ruling most recently in September relative to the liability of the airlines themselves, and that as a motivating factor. Certainly the importance of general social commitment by an organization to both its employees and its community. Business survivability, hopefully a bottom line oriented desire to make some investments in that regard. And also some issues relative to insurance, but that need for having some level of standard to define whether or not an entity is prepared. Other incentives as well, but if we could start at least initially discussing what the existing incentives out there, hold back, if you will, for a moment on what might be developed. But what do you see, each of you, in terms of what's most effective out there right now that is motivating at least some level, and maybe perhaps could offer more prospect and more potential if it was spotlighted? Peter Harvey.
Well, I suppose that a possible answer is that I'll share with the committee is one that I learned on a trip that Attorney General Sampson and I took to London to meet with New Scotland Yard and ultimately with representatives of MI5 as we were trying to better understand terrorism. As many of you know, London has gone through 30 years of bombing. And so there are things that we take for granted here in the United States that just don't exist there, like garbage cans. They don't have them in train stations or out in public because they've had too many experiences of bombs being placed in garbage cans and people walking away and it detonates. But we got a presentation from a fellow who had been, I think, a colonel in the British Army. He was a bomb expert. And he gave us a presentation on what bombs can do to buildings, how they shred glass, how buildings that don't have proper supports will simply collapse. We asked the question, he made the observation that before businesses build buildings in London or throughout England, they come and check with these experts to get their impression of the security procedures that are being, and technology that's being implemented with the construction design. And I said, well, what happens if they don't do that? He said, he looked at me oddly and he said, well, that's the unthinkable. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they won't get insurance. He says, first of all, nobody will build it because of legal liability, and number two, nobody will insure it. I think that there are some market forces out there that will help us get to this goal of security. One is lawyers and lawsuits. They're a very effective tool.
Nobody has said that in the course of our hearings. Nobody has thanked us lawyers at all, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Lawyers will help you get there because they'll simply commence suit and they'll fight about it, and sooner or later somebody will write a huge check and they won't do it anymore. The second is insurance companies. I have been for a long time, and members of my staff have been looking for a bomb expert here in New Jersey because I want to have the capability in the Office of Counterterrorism that's in the Attorney General's office and I've said this to the 23 industry sectors, and I've said it to business groups when I've had the opportunity to talk to them. I want to have the capability of having engineers and bomb experts on my staff that can tell a business and make suggestions to a business how a building ought to be constructed or not constructed. Everything from having pylons embedded in the roadway at a sufficient distance from the structure so that if somebody is driving in a truck, they can't penetrate the building, to what kind of glass to use, what kind of brick to use, what kind of reinforcements to use. I think it's a service the government can provide. Ultimately, I believe that from a national standpoint, it would be very helpful, I think, to have some kind of national organization study these kinds of issues and make recommendations. And you could almost set up committees that can address various industries. These committees can issue guidelines that address those committees. The committees can be made up of persons from government as well as the private sector. And the insurance companies that are looking for guidance can use those kinds of guidelines to measure whether or not they're going to insure or not insure a particular industry. And if the industry says, well, we're not going to abide by national organizations guidelines number 63 or whatever it is, the insurance company can say, fine, if you don't want to abide by those guidelines, then we're going to charge you 200% more than we'll charge somebody who does abide by it.
And in fact, we had that alluded to in the round table. Cognizant of the fact that we have both the opportunity of summarizing the end of the day and also, unfortunately, we are the buffer for any overages prior to that, I'm going to ask each of you perhaps to address both existing as well as prospective incentives in your comments, and we want to give an opportunity to the commissioners, for the commissioners themselves to ask questions of you. So with that being said, Tom, could you
let me
give a
just
perspective?
let me mention three incentives. One is, I think it's really perhaps the most important that General Harvey mentioned, and that is the role of government in assisting the development of best practices, guidance, things of that sort. I also work with a number of small businesses, and they haven't got the foggiest idea. They're not part of a critical infrastructure sector. They probably need to do something. They are very uneasy about the notion of OSHA regulating security. We had this discussion earlier. OSHA may in fact be ubiquitous when it comes to small businesses, but they're not viewed as a friend and ally, and so they would hardly be the ones that would be looked to for guidance. But I think that the Department of Homeland Security, along with whatever agency works with the industry, if any, or with local government for small businesses, could provide tremendous assistance in that regard. Secondly, is if you have a regulatory incentive, that's the carrot, that's the stick. If it's going to be regulatory, I go along with the Orszag, market-friendly. I like that. I'm going to use that term. Performance standards, not command and control standards, maximum flexibility. Agencies are doing that now. I just went through a process with the Coast Guard under the Maritime Security Act, and they allowed industries to develop alternative plans. And they accommodated industry needs as part of those alternative plans. And the alternative plans didn't meet the international standards that were first produced in the Federal Register a year ago, but they accommodated, I mean, in a lot of special cases. And so that approach to regulation, it can be done. And thirdly, incentives. I mean, there is money. Resources are limited in local government, state government, the federal government, and the private sector. And I think all of these so-called solutions that people are coming up with have costs. And we have to remember, there are trade-offs in each instance. And it doesn't work for government to say, oh, that's a good idea, let's impose a mandate on business and let them come up with the money for it, because that kind of approach then makes government unaccountable for what it's requiring ultimately the public to pay. So sure, tax incentives, grants, loan programs, there are a lot of good ideas of how you can spend money to increase private sector preparedness. I think priority setting is probably the most important element of that. We've talked about that some. It was talked about early in the day. All states are not created equal. All ports are not equal. All buildings are not equal. All chemical facilities are not equal. And so we have to set our priorities before we start allocating resources.
Thank you, Tom. James?
Well, currently for a building owner or manager, an incentive for preparedness is pure rent. If you could say I installed, I have canine bomb detection dogs on my facilities, I have safety bollards, I have x-ray machines, card access, CCTV, turnstiles, just to name a few of what some of the owners are going through, hopefully you could drive your rent roll. You get a prospective tenant. The financial institutions are probably the people that drive this right now, and they're willing to pay a premium to have that at your facility. So that's probably the biggest driving force for an incentive, as well as most of the big property managers and owners of Manhattan feel it's a social responsibility to keep Manhattan safe. And also, it's an asset. They're billion-dollar assets to everybody. Nobody wants to see them fall. Nobody wants to see them have a terrible accident which you couldn't recover from and probably kill your company. The future incentives, everybody would love to see us to meet some kind of standard and get a lower premium insurance for terrorism insurance. There's no question about that. And rebate on real estate taxes maybe. Or New York State has NYSERDA rebates where you can get electrical money spent as long as you increase your capacity or you do some kind of savings of kilowatts. If there's something out there like that where people could put money into a building because I met a certain criteria, people are very willing to do that.
Thank you, James. Peter?
First, with regard to current incentives, I would join my co-panelists in noting that legal liability and lawyers do provide incentives. But I think that's actually a good example in which there are inherent limits. Take an example where you have a firm worth, make up whatever number you want, $1 billion. That firm has an incentive to avoid a catastrophic attack, but it has no extra incentive to avoid an attack that would have imposed costs of $10 billion, $100 billion, $2 trillion, because of the great thing of limited liability attached to corporations. So that illustrates that there is an incentive, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't do everything that we need to do because there's no incentive for the firm to avoid the really catastrophic attack as opposed to the somewhat catastrophic attack. Forward-looking, again, I think market-based regulations will play some role. By market-based or performance-based, I mean we don't specify the number of exit doors you need and the number of this thing and that thing you need. Instead, you set a target. For example, you need to be able to show if you've got more than X thousand people in your building that you can evacuate them within Y period of time. And whatever way you want to come up with achieving that goal, that's fine, but you have to show us that you can do it. And I'd agree, I think the Coast Guard, the recent regulatory rulemaking was actually a fairly good example of what could be done. Also forward-looking, we need to avoid creating a massive government bureaucracy in these areas. We can't afford that, and it wouldn't make good sense anyway. There are promising examples at the state level in which you don't need such a large bureaucracy. Let me give you one example. In Delaware and Pennsylvania, in order to conform with Section 112R, which applies to the safety instead of security, but the safety of chemical plants, the state-level EPAs have allowed insurance firms, have basically said, okay, insurance firms, you can go out and hire third-party auditors to go in and inspect the firms. That then feeds back into the insurance premiums and provides guidance to the insurance firms and to the chemical facilities themselves. But the third-party auditors are then playing a very important role because you don't need as many EPA officials. Furthermore, they're becoming centers of best practices. They can go into, after visiting plants A, B, and C, they can go into plant D and say, well, you guys really didn't do so well here, and you should know what other firms in the industry are doing. You could do this, you could do that, to help get the security up to a sufficient level. I think that kind of model is the right one in many sectors. Finally, on tax incentives, while they may have a role in the portfolio, I would just remind the panel that we do face a very significant fiscal gap at the federal level, and so there are inherent limits to the degree to which we can unfortunately take advantage of that tool without passing more costs on in terms of future national income.
Peter, thank you. Final point, very briefly, in terms of education, at least what was distilled down in terms of the commentary given to us by the various round tables, was essentially threefold. Number one, give us some sort of standards what to do in terms of the private sector. Number two, publicize and give us some sort of sense of what the incentives are to do it. Tell us why we should do it. And finally, promote in your efforts one way or another some sort of level of training so that we know how to do it. And that, I think, perhaps most succinctly really reflects what the comments were in terms of the actual roundtable discussions that we held prior to this. That being said, I would certainly defer to the Commission and whoever would care to speak.